Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Climate and Water Initiative's video podcast series, Water Cooler Conversations. And for today, we are featuring a special guest and friend and colleague, Lama Elhatow. She is an environmental specialist with many, many years of experience. She's currently also affiliated with Johns Hopkins University. She's a program coordinator, lecturer there, under a couple of master's programs related to environmental science and climate policy, those types of areas. So, Lema, welcome to our show and very, very glad and looking forward to our conversation.
Thank you for having me, Mohammed. It's a pleasure to be here.
Perfect. So, uh, if you don't mind me maybe exposing some things, we have a shared history that we stumbled upon when we started to work together professionally, which I think came as a surprise to both of us and was unexpected. So, I'm gonna share sort of my perspective on that, and I'd love to hear your other side of the coin. We were, was it born and raised or raised? So we were born
Born and
both
raised.
we were both born and raised in the same place at practically around the same time. Why don't you tell me from your angle? I don't wanna be the one to spill the beans.
Mohammed and I were born and raised in the same place at the same time, moved countries at the same time, and ended up specializing in the exact same major and pursuing research in the exact same topic. Lo and behold, we would end up meeting many, many, many decades later. Let's not put a number to it so we don't
Mm,
give off our ages, but many,
yeah,
many years later, discovering how was that possible? How have we never come across each other in all of these paths and these trajectories? But yes, we were both born and raised in Kuwait, had to move because of the war in Kuwait. Both ended up moving to Egypt, both ended up then pursuing environmental studies and water and climate change, and ended up both doing our research on the Nile River Basin. And here we are today.
it's incredible.
So
And you hear these stories, and it's happened to me in other circles, but it's so surreal to be so close and not, so close and parallel, but never quite intersecting. I don't think we went to the same high school though, or school.
we didn't. But I mean, close enough. We were in the
Yeah.
same area, the same
Yeah.
district, same region. So, we didn't end up meeting for miraculous reasons. God has a plan, but all in good time. We met at the right
Yeah.
time here in DC, out of all places,
Yeah. Yeah.
and all in good time.
Yeah, incredible. I've known you for a number of years, but I did do a little research ahead of our chat, and I was surprised. I learned some things about you that I did not know about. I know you now because of your work on water issues, right? I mean, yes, environmental aspect, environmental background. But for me, when I think of you, I think of the work that you do on the water resources side, and we'll dive on into that a little bit later. But a part of your previous work that I just really didn't appreciate because of so much, how much I was blinded with the work that you did on the water side of things was, on around maybe 12 to 15 years ago, on climate activism. And as I was as we were preparing, of course, just to do our due diligence, I discovered a lot of media content, actually, video content of you on the climate activism side. I think you were in COP 18 in Doha. There was even a TED Talk. In your career track, talk to me about your sort of climate activism days and how that fit in with everything else that you ended up doing in terms of environmental work and your water resources and water security work.
Thank you, Mohammed. It's actually kind of interesting because I don't know that those days necessarily have ended. I think I still consider myself a climate activist at best, and so, or I hope at least I still can consider myself one. But it was interesting. I actually it started off right out of university, fresh grad. I was very excited about the climate field, and immediately, this was back actually in the COP in Copenhagen. So we're talking 2009. That was my very first COP, and very excited to be a part of the climate movement, wanted to get engaged in climate change issues. And so I immediately contacted, and I was starting to look at what civil society organizations around the Arab world were doing activism work in the negotiations in the COPs. And to my disappointment and dismay, there was only one that was registered under the UNFCCC at the time. That was in fact registered as an Arab civil society organization, and they're called Indie Act,
Mm.
the League of Independent Activists, and they're based out of Beirut in Lebanon. And so I sent them an email and I told them, look, I'm an Egyptian. I just graduated. I have my master's from environmental engineering. I'm super excited about the climate movement. I was just about to start my PhD in climate change and water issues, and I want to go. I want to be engaged. And I was 20 years old at the time, 21, something like that.
Mm.
And they said, look, we have no funding. We have no place for you to stay. We have nothing. But if you're excited, we can get you a badge and come.
Mm.
And I said, okay. And I booked my plane to Copenhagen and I went and I couch surfed. I remember it was Copenhagen and they had a bunch of couch surfing programs all across Denmark. And I stayed in one that was an hour away from the convention and I commuted every day. And the head of IndieAct at the time wanted us to have briefing meetings at 6 a.m. every morning. So I was up from 4 a.m. to commute
Wow.
in so I could be there. It was some very fascinating times. But I learned everything about climate activism from being in probably the most chaotic COP I have ever actually been in, which was Copenhagen. And it was full of, passion and excitement, but also a lot of disappointment and dismay, obviously for obvious reasons that we now know of, that it was intended to come up with this agreement that it didn't end up coming out with anything. And since then, that kind of piloted my career. I ended up uh, going into the UNFCCC negotiations and attending several COPs almost every single year after that for about 9 years. Was very heavily involved in the mitigation and adaptation tracks on the climate policy front. I was attending intersessionals. I was getting very, very engaged. At the time, there was also, we were forming in the Act as well as a lot of the initiatives that I was working in with CAN. I was a part of Climate Action Network International
Mm.
as the mitigation track officer at the time. And what we were doing is we were also we founded at what was referred to as the AYCM, the Arab Youth Climate Movement, and this was right before the COP that happened in Doha in Qatar, because we wanted to have more representation from the Arab world because at the time there was like three of us. And that was the whole point is we wanted to have capacity building and training, and so we did that. So we piloted the AYCM at the time, right before the COP in Doha, and we started training people, a lot of youth obviously coming in. We had AYCM chapters from Egypt, from Qatar, from Bahrain. Many of them now are actually, I think Nishad is
I was
one of your
I was
researchers.
gonna mention Nishad was connected with
Nishad is one of the people we ended up training. We ended up training many others. Mariam Alem, who is now a delegate actually in the Egyptian official Egyptian delegates for the COP negotiations. We ended up we mentored and trained many people actually, from Sudan and from Qatar and from Bahrain. Many people you and I both know, Reem and Tariq Al-Alimi, many people. So the AYCM really built in this movement of people from across the region, from civil society persons that we needed to gain momentum because at some point it really was about three or four of us that were attending these COP negotiations, and there was no other representation in the Arab world. So that was wonderful. That was really, really beautiful. And then I started getting very tired on the global front when I started realizing that there was very little action that was happening and there were steps were very, very slow in terms of progress. So I started working more on the domestic front and tried to do more initiatives domestically in Egypt and were in terms of working towards climate activism. I founded an initiative, a co-founded initiative called the ENCC, which is the Egyptian National Climate Change Coalition, which was working with another founder, Sara Rifat, at the time, who we ended up bridging together basically persons from civil society, NGOs, private sector, anyone working in the climate space across water, agriculture, energy, to come together and build coalitions and campaigns that could end up moving forward. So there were some that were working on sustainable mobility and cycling initiatives across Egypt. Many of the people that we now know of, Ahmed Durghami, and all those ended up piloting out of ENCC. A major campaign and initiative that definitely also sprung out of the ENCC was the Egyptians Against Coal campaign,
Mhm.
which many people we also know of established, and as we now know, unfortunately didn't succeed, but it did gain momentum at the time, along with the the then Minister of Environment, so Dr. Laila Skandar, and many others. Um, but it paved the way for collaborations to exist, and that was the idea behind the NCC, is to bring these connections together, bring the networks together from across the country to see who's doing what, as opposed to everybody working in silos. And that's where I felt like the most work needs to be done is there's a lot of people within the movement, within the climate movement that are very passionate about it, want to do something, are very engaged, but everybody's working in their own silo. So how can we bring them together, train them, mentor them in that capacity to be able to actually do something and move forward? So we were training people in under INCC on various NGOs on how to create a proposal for funding, or how do you actually go out and build a biogas generator, or what do you begin to do in order to actually find different networks that can actually that you can bridge to help find like-minded persons that you can work with. So there were initiatives like Ice Cairo that ended up coming around, or Ice Alex. All of these were I don't want to say housed or bridged, but they were initiatives that were all sprouting from these networks that we ended up collaborating together, which was a really beautiful initiative at the time.
Yeah.
Of course, the momentum, especially after the Egyptian Revolution in 2011, did help because a lot of people were very, very empowered after the Egyptian Revolution,
Yeah.
including myself and many others, with the sense of we can do something. We can actually make a difference in the country. We can move things towards a trajectory of environmental sustainability and climate activism. And there was this sense of hope that we could make a difference. And in many places we did. And I hope still trying to do and pushing that lever a little bit more every day. But yeah, that's it.
That's amazing. It just it was a small thread I wanted to pull, and several things struck me in what you said. Number one, you are an OG climate activist from the Middle East that I just again, you've done so many things that it's maybe it's me. It just got lost in the shuffle and all the things that you do, but you were there. I mean, this is what you're telling me is a lot of the grassroots efforts, obviously a lot of it in Egypt, right, where you were sort of centered, but the laying the seeds for a lot of the work to, not to say that it didn't exist in some small form or fashion, but to sort of apply efforts to help accelerate and it's amazing to hear of all the people we know, found their roots and their seeds came back from, from that period that you were talking about. So that's amazing. What an inspiring sort of origin story, if you will, of and as you said, it's not over. But again, I'm so focused on the things that you do related to water because it's a very strong common thread we have, and we'll touch on it. But thank you for sharing that. I mean, that's incredible. And you are still engaged to some level, even though you're doing many different things, right? Do you still have your toe in that world?
Yeah, yes and no. And like you said, my career has shifted, and so I'm still very much in familiar and in tune with what's happening on the COP climate negotiations. I do attend every once in a while. I attend to Dubai, Sharm, and so forth. I don't make it a regular thing anymore. I am trying to work in other spaces, but that being said, I think that what's happening now with the climate movement is no longer, and I think a lot of people are beginning to realize this. It's not just about the COP negotiations and what happens on a global level. It's what we can begin to do and push the lever in various other instances, whether it be in education, whether it be in awareness, whether it be in the various sectors that we work in on the ground, on national policy and grassroots level, and how can we actually make those differences? So, as much as the global COP negotiations are significant and important and pivotal,
Mhm.
we need to be working in parallel in various other platforms to make that effort also work, because otherwise it becomes pointless.
Yeah. Can I also mention another throwback? This feels like this is a, a review of your professional life. It's good to have these moments because I'm like, oh wow, seeing the body of work from a different set of eyes is just really eye-opening. Can I talk about some other thing that we found when we were researching for this episode? You were also the co-founder of the Water Institute of the Nile. I did not know this at all. And can you tell me that part of your journey, how that came to be? And
It's a beautiful one, but also a painful one. But yes, I will speak of it. WIN, the Water Institute of the Nile, is a think tank that emerged again after the Egyptian Revolution when many of us were empowered and very, very much engaged. As you could tell after the revolution, I did a lot of things.
Things changed.
I did a lot of things at the time. I look back and I think, God, where was all that energy? Where is that energy now? But yes, I did. I co-founded a think tank called the Water Institute of the Nile, WIN, the acronym, with a couple of others, and the idea behind it, behind WIN, was that, and this was around the same time that the controversy around GERD, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, was starting to take place in the early to 2011, 2012, right after the revolution years.
Yes.
Um, as many of you we know, and of course, Muhammad, what ended up happening was is that the Ethiopian dam, the GERD, was a lot of it was talk for a very, very long time. And then at the same time when the Egyptian Revolution, but there was always sort of a spiff between Ethiopia and Egypt around the construction of the dam. So when the Egyptian Revolution took place in 2011, the Ethiopian government took the opportunity with all of that was happening with Egypt, and they went ahead and they started constructing it. Um, and in doing so, it created quite a bit of controversy with downstream countries, both Egypt and Sudan at the time, but mostly Egypt, I would have to say. And in doing so, there was quite a bit of heat around that area, and still is, but I would say that the bulk of the heat and the prime of the heat was right around that time.
Yeah.
Um, and there was a lot of research that was coming out, a lot of studies, a lot of scientific papers that were actually trying to show whether or not this dam was going to be positive for downstream countries, negative for downstream countries, whether it was going to have a win-win beneficial impact. And there was a lot of misconceptions and lies and
Mhm.
misinformation that was being dispelled left and right. It's funny, and not much changes over time, but I mean, if you think about a lot of sort of the misinformation now around science and information, um, continues, it still persists, but a lot of that was pervading around in that time. And we wanted to create a platform whereby we could correct a lot of the myths and the misconceptions that were happening around what was going on on GERD to not necessarily quell the fears that people were having both domestically in Egypt and Sudan, and in Ethiopia, but also to engage an alternative platform than what was happening in terms of track one diplomacy, which is the governmental sort of collaborations that were taking place,
Right.
whereby at that point there was zero civil society and stakeholder engagement that was taking place. So we created WIN as a form of track three diplomacy, a form of civil society engagement between the countries, the communities, to come together, and those that are most vulnerable from climate impacts to really bridge that gap and have those stories being told along the Nile. And that was the vision, that was the idea behind it. And when we started it, it was to create this alternative platform from what the government was doing to have civil society engage with one another, to quell the myths, any misinformation that was happening around, so that it wouldn't spur any further escalations and quell a lot of those fears based on actual factual science and not misinformation,
Yeah.
but also to engage sort of the public in this idea that we can actually do something to work together. The community and the civil society doesn't have to remain silent in what is happening. So we started doing several things. We started creating videos
Mhm.
online on platforms, actually on various platforms. There was one on Khan Academy and various others that we started producing on sort of the science around GERD and what are the actual impacts. They're mostly in Arabic, of course,
Mhm.
but does have English subtitles and translations. We started producing policy papers to the Egyptian government, or there were so many at the time, but it was the transitionary government at the time in 2013 and 2014, that was discussing with SCAF, with the security, with the military. But we were speaking also with several people from the presidential cabinet as well as the prime minister in order to be able to get sort of those policies instigated.
Mhm.
Um, and we were being heard at a time when youth and civil society and think tanks that would never have been heard. We were actually being heard, which was phenomenal.
Mhm.
So we were able to get those kinds of policies and ideas and mechanisms of community collaboration out to sort of the presidency, which was a beautiful thing. We ended up working for a number of years, I would have to say, but as many of the initiatives that ended up spurring after the revolution, um, many of them also fizzled out and died. And unfortunately, Win was one of them, which also ended up fizzling out several years later. It's a beautiful story, but it's also one that's quite painful because it ended up unfortunately also dying. She also founded a green political party in Egypt,
Oh, wow.
which had shut down 6 months later. But as many things we tried quite a bit at the time to do a lot of things.
Yeah. Well, I think the reality is a lot of these things that you do, initiatives, we may be at the moment thinking they will be the be all end all, but the reality is when you look at it holistically, a lot of them end up being stepping stones to bigger things, right? Which doesn't reduce the sort of the difficult emotion of them at that particular point in time ending, but sometimes you take two steps forward, one step back to then take five steps forward, right? And it's hard to see that in the moment, especially things like this, right? That are they're driven by your own passion, right? Your own time, your own motivation, when it's something of your own, right? Versus working for somebody else. It always will feel different, right? It carries a piece of you. So I can certainly appreciate that. So this gets us to where what I really want to talk about is the Nile. And we obviously both share a connection to the Nile. Yourself from Egypt, myself from Sudan. And we are both very immersed in the issues of the Nile. You, as for all the things you've just mentioned. You also have a further personal connection. I mean, a lot of people that are in the Nile, when we think about certainly the three primary nations that are having, the discussions and issues and challenges on the GERD, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, Egypt, Sudan, and Ethiopia. But you're one of, I think, a special cohort that has gone beyond looking at it and physically looking at it from where you are in the case of being Egypt, or in my case, just seeing it in Sudan. Although I also saw it in Egypt because, as we mentioned, I spent time in Egypt after after our mutual time in Kuwait. You spent time in Sudan, and you have developed a very uh, sort of special relationship because of that between countries based on the Nile. I'd love to hear more about that experience and the purpose of your time, what you did, what you learned, and really more importantly, what you took away from it.
I pride myself actually on this fact that that I wasn't just a researcher on the Nile Basin. I wasn't someone, and I actually not just visited Sudan and Ethiopia. I visited actually every single Nile Basin country, and I'm very very proud to say that I visited every single Nile Basin country: Uganda, Rwanda, Kenya. I'm very very proud to say that I actually visited with the exception of South Sudan, of course. But
Well,
all the
technically,
rest.
if you visited while it was not South Sudan, maybe we can
I
make an
did. That
exception.
is actually accurate. I did visit, but when
There
it
you
was
go.
one country. So, I mean,
It counts. It
that,
counts. I will allow it. It counts.
that's fair. That is actually fair. I did visit before. But that being said, yes, I visited all the countries, and I've been to several places across Sudan and across Ethiopia, across Rwanda and Uganda. Visited Lake Victoria, went all the way down to Jinja, the source of the Nile River, and so I do pride myself in that I wasn't just a researcher digging it up for the research. I do have I don't want to say past tense. I do still have very much a very strong connection to this river body. And it's one that really does keep bringing us back. I mean, if you think about the Nile from so many different contexts, and again, I know I'm supposed to remain technical here, but even from a spiritual standpoint, the religious texts that talk about the Nile River that go back from the times of Moses to the times of all the prophets, it is a river body that is very sacred. And there is something very glorious and very magical about this river body from the source all the way down to its end. And it really is a magical river. And so going to Sudan was one of the most beautiful and I would say magical moments of my experience on the Nile, for various reasons. And it was because, and I might have actually told you this story before. I'm not sure if I've told you this about the poets. the
Yes.
Arab poets, the Sudanese poets specifically, who speak about the Nile. But the Sudanese uh, do something very beautiful. They write a lot of poetry around the Nile. Actually, all of the communities along the Nile do this, but the Sudanese do it in a very romantic way, which I think is glorious. And there's an Arab poet, a Sudanese poet, who actually wrote a beautiful piece of poetry around sort of the confluence of the Nile when it meets in Khartoum.
Mm.
And so the idea behind it is that you have the Blue River, the Blue Nile, pardon, that comes from the Ethiopian highlands, as you know, and it's very rich in sediment going through the gorge, and so it's very brownish in color. It's very rich. It goes through rough rapids, and it's a very sort of hectic waters until it reaches and flows down to south until it reaches Khartoum.
Mm.
And then you have the White Nile, which comes from further south from Uganda, from Jinja, which is goes through the marshlands and the sud swamps of South Sudan. And so there's this natural filtration process that begins to happen. And so by the time it reaches Sudan, the color is very crystal clear. It's very white, hence the name White Nile. It's these clear, transparent waters that have been filtered through. And so in Khartoum, in Sudan specifically, you have these two very distinctly different colored waters that end up meeting at the confluence in Khartoum, the Blue Nile, which is very brownish in color, and the Blue Nile and the White Nile, which come together, and they meet at the confluence in Sudan, and they move together for kilometers and kilometers and kilometers without mixing, subhanallah, without mixing at all. They just move together in complete harmony until there's a slight little rapid, and then they go down and they mix naturally, and then they move north together as a mixed unity towards Egypt. But in doing so, for kilometers and kilometers, they just move untouched next to one another without actually mixing or overriding one another, overpowering one another in any way. And Sudanese Arab poets call this unification, this marriage, if you will, of the two of them coming together, the longest kiss in history,
Wow.
which is
Wow.
it's just absolutely beautiful. So no one's really trying to dominate.
Yeah.
And if we understand that, if we learn from that, we learn from the stories of the waters that come from Ethiopia and from Uganda and from Sudan, is that instead of us overriding, we can really learn from the waters and from this ecosystem that there is no need for any community or any of these countries per se to actually override or overpower, over dominate. Everyone can just live in harmony, moving side by side forever and ever until they finally just naturally mix and it becomes a unification process. And if only we could actually just learn from these waters, from this ecosystem, and learn from the communities that come from it, we would be so better off.
We might have to put you on the long list of the poets after that description. That was just beautiful. I mean, so many lessons there. So many lessons there, what you just said, right? It just, uh, I do it a disservice by even trying to disseminate what you just said because it beautifully encapsulates, I think, the the difficulty, but also the beauty of what, collaboration could look like. If and nature's almost showing us, right, by this example, which is beautiful, which is absolutely beautiful. Um, Now I'm curious. We started talking about, obviously, from the angle of Sudan, Egypt. What are some of the interesting things you saw as you journeyed to all these other countries, which I did not know that you did? What were some of, small things that you noticed or experiences of how communities relate to that water body, and what are some of the things that stuck with you in these other places?
You know, it's ironic because I know that you're bringing me here as a technical expert, as an engineer to talk about it, because that's what I do. But I find myself more and more and more coming back to talk to you about how sacred this natural water body is, and that's the irony of this right here.
Mm.
Um, because that is the one thing that I've found really, really unifies all of the communities that I've observed across the Nile Basin, from Injinja in Uganda to Sudan to Aswan in Egypt to Ethiopia. There is a very, very sacred connection that all of these communities have to the water body that is really, really beautiful. In Uganda, for instance, and this is a very famous story actually that goes back to a lot of some of my professional work as well. I worked for the World Bank for 15 years as an environmental and social specialist, working on infrastructure projects and looking at sort of the environmental and social standards that go into infrastructure projects like dams, like solar plants, like wind farms, like green energy plants. Otherwise, to be able to see what we need to do in order to make sure that they are, of course, adhering to standards. Of course, making sure that the communities are involved, labor standards are adhered to, and all the above. Um, one of the dams that was built in the Nile, the Bujagali Dam, it was funded by the World Bank. And the Bujagali Dam has a very famous story behind it because there is one of the performance standards. There's 8 performance standards for environmental and social sustainability that we need to go and we need to sort of cross-check and do appraisals and supervisions for when we're looking at projects. Those relate to sort of the systems, energy, water, greenhouse gas emissions, water utility, all the above, community, labor. But one of them also goes to impact cultural heritage and whether or not it's impacting any cultural heritage. Indigenous persons, of course.
Mm.
And in doing so, the Bujagali Dam actually triggered one of these performance standards related to cultural heritage on the Nile River Basin when it was being constructed. And the reason being is that the people that were, and these were tribal communities that were living on the Nile around the area of Bujagali,
Mm.
who actually believed that a lot of the spirits around the rapids of the Nile actually were very sacred. These were their spirits and their ancestors actually would lay. And if this dam were to be created, of course, making the river a lot more stabilized and stagnant, it would then end up removing this turbulence that would come from the rapids, and hence removing again their ancestors, which was a very big problem. There was huge amounts of protests, there was dissent, it was quite problematic. So the World Bank, in order to adhere to these performance standards, because what are we going to do? This dam needs to be constructed. How do we do this in a way that is also adhering to the ENS standards and making sure that the community are appeased and are happy, but also doing it in a sustainable practice? What they did, and I wasn't involved in this project, but this was a famous story that was told on because this was before my time.
Mm.
Um, was is that they actually ended up the World Bank ended up paying for the ancestral passage of these spirits to be relocated from these rapids. They needed to have consent from the ancestors to
Okay.
be relocated from one of the rapids to another location so that they could be laid to rest in in that manner, and that the people would end up being able to visit their ancestors and the spirits of the rapids in another location. So there was a whole ritual, there was a whole process that ended up being conducted in order to make sure that that actually went into place. Which was for the first time actually that the World Bank had ever done that, which is again why the story of that the World Bank funded a ritual passage
Mm.
for ancestors on the spirits of the Nile to be moved from one location to another was so pivotal and so remarkable. But this is not a PR for the World Bank. This is more of a message towards the sacredness
Yeah.
of this river body to all of the communities on the Nile and how important it is. You go to Aswan and you speak to the Nubians in Aswan, especially those that have built the high Aswan Dam, and you talk to them about sort of the relationship that they had towards this river body and what does this mean to them and what did it mean for them. A lot of these people don't know how to read and write. And so the mechanism of them constructing the dam during the times of Gamal Abdel Nasser, former president of Egypt, was documented through song. So a lot of these songs came out in terms of we built the dam, we're the ones who rebuilt the dam. But then when it came time to actually being moved and resettled, a lot of these Nubian people who were their livelihoods, their entire incomes were dependent on the Nile Basin, were relocated very, very much inland away from the Nile Basin, very far away from the water body. So they weren't intact. And so this was also very, very this was heart-wrenching for them. This was very difficult for them. And a lot of this came out in song. And so you see this with their song, you see this with their culture, you see this with their heritage, how everything is tied to the Nile. It's funny because even if you go to the Nile, if you've been to Egypt, for instance, and you can visit the Nile in Cairo, for instance, further north, versus if you visit it much more south in Aswan and Nubia, and you'll see the difference in the Nile in its ecology, in the way that it is being kept and it is preserved and its preservation. And a lot of that has to do with the indigenous people and the people who actually grew up with this sacredness of this river body. Whereas in Cairo, due to the urban setting and a lot of the sort of much more industrial establishments and touristic establishments, that connection has become somewhat lost and is more of an aesthetic, beautiful, nonetheless, water body, but much less sacred than it would be in some of the other communities.
I totally agree. At least from a visual perspective, as we said, I spent time in Cairo, and obviously I've been to Sudan, and seeing the Nile in Cairo versus in Khartoum, because as you know, it splits the capital into three parts, Khartoum, Omdurman, Bahri. And when I see it there, it looks like a raging ocean.
Mm.
It's huge. It's immense. Not to say that it's not immense in Cairo, but it almost seems like a muted version itself, which technically and geophysically we understand why. There's a huge dam between those two locations, so then the flow is a little bit more controlled and less chaotic. But that difference was stark to me. To
Yeah.
just touch on one of the points you made, that there is a difference in just as you go upstream and seeing it prior to a lot. I mean, of course, there's dams even upstream, smaller dams upstream of Khartoum, but it just to see it more closer to its sort of natural aesthetic is remarkable.
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah. I think I have a last question for you, which is, if I may, and again, this is very diluted version of your professional career. And I do appreciate that we did not stay technical. This was kind of a Trojan horse. I did say technical, but I really wanted you to touch on the non-technical things. Because to me, in a way, yes, we're engineers, technical stuff awkwardly excites us. But it's the other things, right? It's the in-between, which I think is compelling for us, but I think also for a broader audience. It strikes me that you're definitely an experiential learner, right? When you did the climate activism work, you were literally doing the climate activism work, right? You were in the weeds, grassroots, building on what little was there, extending it, trying your own initiatives, supporting other initiatives, your work with the Nile. Again, we come from a technical background, so it strikes me it just would have been easier to just stay behind the screen, use your resources, and add value in sort of more conventional ways that people do now, right? Which we still kind of do. We write about things and we talk about things in a professional manner. But you literally went and saw, right? You did these things, you experienced these things, you met with these people, you talked to these people, you learned by physically being where these things are happening. And I think it's almost poetic. And of course, your work with the World Bank, which I do know had some element of, I'll call it broadly field work, if you will. But I feel like all of that is a perfect sort of pre-step to what you're doing now as a lecturer in the university setting, where you're educating now. You're taking everything that you learned and you're packaging it for someone else to then begin that same journey. It's almost like a weird karma cycle. Talk about where you are now, right, in your career as someone I think who's passing the knowledge and that unique perspective of taking what you've done and how are you really leveraging that to sort of pass it forward in your current role.
I think I've always known that education is my passion. I think I've always known from the very beginning, since ever since I stumbled upon climate change back when I was in university. And it started actually from a professor, from one professor, Dr. Mushira Hassan, and I need to say her by name because she, along with Dr. Salah Hagar, the two of them, literally introduced me into this idea of climate change and what does this mean. And from the get-go, two very passionate professors in my undergrad career pivoted and completely altered my entire shift and trajectory of my career to knowing that I wanted to become an educator. That is exactly what I wanted to do. If they could spur and inspire me in that way to want to make a difference towards climate change, towards this planet in a much more sustainable way, if I could do the same for just one other person, the way that they did it for me, God, I would be so lucky. And I knew it. I knew it from then that that's what I wanted to do. Is education was going to be my passion. And so my trajectory started very early on, knowing that that's where I wanted to do. And my PhD, we've talked about this, how my PhD journey was a very challenging one, very, very challenging one. But in doing so, I knew that the end result of being able to become a faculty, be able to teach and do that was the ultimate goal and have the end in sight. Um, and so when the time came and I became a full-time faculty at Johns Hopkins University, it was a bittersweet moment. I have to say it was because coming full circle like that is remarkable, and it's just so rewarding sometimes to be able to sit there. And it's funny because a lot of how education has changed in the last couple of years and the way that we look at education, it really is it's transformative because no longer is the professor there to deliver the content. That's not what it's about. With AI and technology and the various platforms and Coursera and whatnot, you could learn a lot of the content from any other various course online or otherwise. But the professor there to deliver a message based on a lot of what you're precisely mentioning. It's based on the field experiences that come with it when you're delivering the content. I'm no longer just mentioning something about climate policy, but how has that been applied to the case study model that we looked at, for instance, in Argentina? How did that work when we tried to apply the green hydrogen model in Barbados? How did it work when we tried to apply it? So there the examples that come with the field experience of 15 plus years of field research and work on the ground that I've done comes with that extra added bonus versus it's not just delivering the content.
Yeah.
In addition to being a professor now also means handling, becoming not just, delivering the content, it comes with being a mentor. It means handling all different kinds, but means a counselor. There's a lot more that a professor has to do than I would say your kind of the traditional job description is. But education is definitely where I found my space, where I found my place, my call. I do think that what I do end up pursuing and continuing to do will be within the realm of education. Um, and not just as a professor or lecturing. I mean, that's one platform, but I do want to continue to train people as I've been training people throughout the Arab world, civil society on climate issues and otherwise. I still want to continue to do that. It's a
Mm.
big part of capacity building and education and training. And I feel that that is my passion. That's the core of what my calling actually comes down to. It's being an educator in that space. Um, and if I could inspire just one person, the way that again those two professors inspired me, God, I would be so lucky leaving this planet.
Well, spoiler alert, I think that's already been achieved. I can at least speak for myself. I find you've inspired me in a number of ways, and I would find it difficult to believe that you haven't absolutely inspired your students, many students that you've had. And I love the point that you made that the world is changing so fast in terms of technology and the whole thing with AI and the resources available to disseminate and absorb information. Uh, what makes a professor or educator different? How do they stand out against all these resources if you look at it conventionally? And you touch on this perfect point, which is the degrees and the accolades and all these things. That's not the reason. It's what's behind them, right? It's what's done to achieve them that gives that personal experience with the things that are being instructed. And I think that adds value to people that are learning, right? Because it's not, at the end of the day, what you're distributing in terms of information, the facts are the facts. But people, at least myself, I remember facts based on sort of my personal connection to them and how I feel about certain things and topics. And I think that's where you stand out. So I'm really, really happy to hear that. Obviously, I'm not surprised, but I'm happy to hear that that's the approach that you're doing. I was going to ask you for a final message, but I think that what you just said was perfection. So I don't want to mess with a perfect cake at this point. I mean, unless you really feel strongly about adding something else to that. But if not, this is sort of as we're winding down, I want to give you an opportunity to not so much a formal plug, but maybe talk about, are there things that you're currently doing, something in the pipeline that you want to share? Maybe there's a report coming out, maybe there's an activity or an engagement that you're involved in, where people may, see you and find you if that's something you're willing to share, but something that you're currently doing or is on the horizon that you sort of want to share with our audience.
Sure, I can do that. This might be a little bit early because it's still in the preliminary phases, but one thing I am currently doing is and this is aside from my teaching job, and because it's still centered around teaching,
Mm,
but not in the same format. So I've always been excited about travel and exploring different places, as I
mm,
think it's become clear. Um, but the idea behind travel, and this goes around the idea or the premise of I'm sure you probably heard travel with purpose,
yeah,
whereby you're going into a community and that you're not just there to be a let's go buy an I Love Paris t-shirt and walk away, and that's where how we've observed or gone into that city or area. Um, his ideas is I would like to take people into ecosystems, very specific ecosystems. And through those ecosystems is to try to build it in a way and to help manage those ecosystems for the better. So using two aspects here, and this is what where the two sort of my I guess you could say current passions are kind of coming together, which is climate and technology, bridging the two, climate and tech, in a fashion whereby we can actually help solve the climate crisis using technology and climate change and the understanding and the stories that we have around climate change and what we can do to help further ecosystems in that means. So, in doing so, it would be taking people, students or travelers or adults or whoever, to certain ecosystems, telling them about that ecosystem, whether it be a hike through, a certain desert or a Sinai or the forest or scuba diving or otherwise, but with a mechanism of understanding how it is that we can also help um, solve some of the issues that they are going through. So it could be heat waves, for instance, from climate change. It could be coral bleaching from climate change, whatever it is that that ecosystem is currently undergoing in a dire mechanism, and how we can help assist in various means. Um, that is my current, I guess you could say, project.
mm.
And yeah,
Well, I'm
stay
excited.
tuned. Stay tuned.
Yeah, no, that sounds very exciting. I can't wait to hear more once you get to that point and sort of add wheels to that once it's closer to its final form. Lemma, always, always, always enjoy talking with you. You are a fountain of knowledge and, frankly, inspiration. And I think our audience and maybe earlier in their career path that are exploring similar trajectories, I think will find value in the path that you've taken forward. And again, you're educating even when you're not intentionally doing so. So I think that you can add that as another feather in achieving your intended objective. Thank you so very much, and thank you all for tuning in to this episode. And we look forward to having you join us in a future episode of Water Cooler Conversations by the Climate and Water Initiative. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mohammed. Thank you for having me.